Right, so today I want to talk about this issue of the threat of the greylisting of the South African financial system by the Financial Action Task Force. So the very first thing that we need to understand is the Financial Action Task Force is an organization created by the G7. The G7 countries are the same countries that perpetuated the worst human rights violations and crimes against humanity in the form of slavery, colonialism, and today they continue slavery and colonialism through what is called neo-colonialism, when you see the United States, Western allies, under NATO going to attack third world nations that are rich in resources, oil, land, and they go and attack these nations, take their resources, displace their people, and cause the deaths of over millions of people. So over the past 22 years, we have seen over 3 million people being killed in Arab countries: Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria. And they've been killed for their oil by the same Western nations under NATO, because NATO wants to control their resources and wants to subjugate the populations of those nations to be slaves for them. That is neo-colonialism that these countries continue. But additional to that, the biggest financial crimes of all time. So we start with the Great Depression last century. We come into this century. We look at the banking crisis of 2008 that lost the world over $40 trillion. They were all perpetuated by the G7 nations or in the G7 nations. The biggest crimes of all time: First World War, Second World War, Vietnam War, all those have been perpetrated by the very same nations in the G7. The Jewish Holocaust was perpetuated by a country that is a member of the G7 nations. So the point I'm making is that the G7 nations are morally depraved, genocidal countries that have caused slavery, colonialism, and the biggest wars of all time, that have eliminated over 500 million people in just 150 years. And those are the same nations that sat to create the Financial Action Task Force, to be an instrument or an organization that regulates financial transactions to ensure that there's no organized crime, there's no funding of terrorism, and that there is no money laundering. Now, for those of you that are well read, you would understand that the very same nations, these G7 nations, have been implicated in the creation of terrorist groups and funding of terrorism all across the world to destabilize countries that are rich in resources, rich in oil, so that these nations, these very same G7 nations, can continue to control the resources and the people and labor in these countries as they did during colonialism. And so you need to understand the irony of them creating the Financial Action Task Force to regulate organized crime when they are the ones that are said to be dealing in drugs. We heard that the Americans went to Afghanistan to control the heroin market, and we understand that they're in South America to control cocaine. And for them to create an organization to control money laundering, organized crime, or funding of terrorism, it's ironic. Most terrorists across the world have got weapons that come from companies of these very same countries in their military-industrial complex that manufactures the weapons that end up in the hands of terrorists. And the terrorists, like the Bin Laden family, have been associated with the Americans, funded by the Americans through American banking systems and Western banking systems. But today they formed the Financial Action Task Force to stop money laundering, organized crime, and the funding of terrorism, which is very ironic. However, we now need to look at what it is that the Financial Action Task Force does. Financial Action Task Force was created in 1989, and it was created to stop drug trafficking and the proceeds of drug trafficking getting into the banking system. Everybody knows that the CIA is associated with controlling drugs and drug trafficking and the sale of drugs all across the world. We know that America was in Afghanistan controlling the production of heroin and its marketing throughout the world. So how can the Financial Action Task Force have been created to stop drug trafficking when it's controlled by the CIA and some of the biggest powers in the world? The British Empire was built on opium trading through the Sassoon family. They also say that they want to stop the financing of terrorism. How do they stop the financing of terrorism when most of the weapons and the terrorist groups that exist are funded and created by the Americans and their proxies in NATO? And more importantly, how do they stop money laundering? Colonialism was about stealing African land, stealing African resources, controlling property that did not belong to Western powers, making money from that, and then sending those proceeds that are made illegally from the exploitation of Africa, the stealing of African resources, and the enslavement of African labor, and then laundering it into the financial system of the world and making it legitimate funds. So all these things are things done by the West more than anybody else. It becomes difficult to believe that they are here to control money laundering, counter to, the funding of terrorism or organized crime. But let me give you an example. So now, the Financial Action Task Force is saying that it is investigating South Africa for threatening the global financial system by doing the following activities: not punishing corruption. In their document, they cite that South Africa has not taken enough steps to punish corruption because it had a state capture commission, and from that state capture commission, very few prosecutions have taken place from the people that were implicated in that commission. Very few of them be taken to courts and found guilty for South Africa to show that it is trying to stop corruption. To them, the Financial Action Task Force, corruption is a very critical crime to be looked at because corruption causes illicit finances to be generated through that corruption, and those illicit finances can then be laundered or money laundered or cleaned to go into the legitimate banking system, and then those that have committed the crimes can then enjoy the money later. They also say that they are flagging the South African financial system because it does not have a register of beneficiaries of businesses, trusts, and properties in South Africa. What they're saying here is we don't know who are the people that are benefiting from the companies, from the shares, from the control of real estate, from the control of trusts in South Africa. So that money might be controlled by terrorists who then earn money through these institutions and then put that money into the normal financial system to fund terrorism. They say another problem is that the South African economy uses too much cash. So the unbankable people use cash. The people that do not earn salaries within their bank accounts, but they receive envelopes as wages, they use too much cash. And there's too much informal businesses that are using cash, and that cash cannot be traced, and the owners of those cash and the people using the cash cannot be traced. So it becomes difficult for the financial intelligence centers that have been created by FATF in every country for them to follow and monitor those people. And this, they say, is posing a threat to the global financial system, as these illicit finances or potential illicit finances can then be utilized to fund terrorism all over the African continent. They then raise another point and say that South Africa does not identify certain crimes, particularly violent crime, as terrorism, and the people that perpetuate these crimes are not being identified as terrorists. And so therefore these proceeds that come from taxi violence, drug trafficking, and other forms of crime that come with violence are not being flagged as terrorism. And so those terrorists are going under the radar because the South African financial system does not identify them as terrorists. It also goes on to give other reasons, like that South Africa does not focus on terrorism, organized crime, but it focuses too much on fraud. And they believe that South Africa must focus more on corruption, terrorism, violence, and its relationship to money laundering and other crimes that are considered as organized crime, for it to be able to fight these crimes properly. And finally, they say that the administrative processes and the laws that are being made in South Africa are not strong enough to fight these forms of crimes that are constituted as funding of terrorism or money laundering. So now we say that maybe the Financial Action Task Force might be serious about the issues that it brings up. But then we've got a simple case that just came up yesterday. Glencore was found guilty of bribing African officials and other officials all across the world, including in South Africa. It was found guilty of carrying large amounts of money on private jets to come and bribe officials, members of state-owned enterprises, and other government officials within the countries that were named in Africa, including South Africa and other parts of the world. So what this means is that Glencore was found guilty of corruption, bribery, and this movement of money that actually crosses borders without being declared can be deemed as money laundering. And the monies that were paid as bribes could equally have been funding terrorism, as the Financial Action Task Force has been saying. Glencore was found guilty, but the South African banks have not blocked Glencore's accounts. This is a problem because the financial system of South Africa has been blocking the accounts of Zimbabweans on the basis that these Zimbabweans are under sanctions. They have gone on to block the bank accounts of those that are on sanctions lists, which were said to be illegal by the UN, by the way. They've also gone to block the accounts of relatives of people that are on the sanctions list, and they've gone to block accounts of even people that are deemed to have worked for the government of Zimbabwe. They have done this to those people, yet those people have never been found guilty of any crime. They've done this to Zimbabweans, yet they've never been tried for any crimes that warrant them to be put under sanctions or warrant them to be considered as money launderers or terrorists. But the South African banking system will close their bank accounts, will block their funds, will confiscate their funds, will deny them loans, will even deny to sell them foreign currency when they're passing through South Africa without trial and when these people are innocent. But they do not block the bank accounts of Glencore that was just found guilty of corruption, bribery, and potentially money laundering and funding of terrorism. We say funding of terrorism because Glencore has been associated with funding rebels in Congo and other countries where they are, and that is a crime or a predicate crime according to the Financial Action Task Force. So why has the South African banking system not complied with the courts that have found Glencore guilty and close their bank accounts as they do with Zimbabweans who are innocent? If they can illegally close the bank accounts of Zimbabweans who have never been found guilty by any court, Zimbabweans who are under illegal US sanctions, how is it that South African banks illegally implement these US sanctions that are illegal according to international law, that violate human rights? How do they block these bank accounts on this illegality and crime against humanity or persecution by the United States upon the Zimbabwean people, but they cannot close the bank accounts of Glencore that is clearly violating international law, clearly breaking anti-money laundering laws, and clearly infringing on what the UN says needs to control terrorism funding? Additionally, we've got a guy called Iqbal Survey who owns companies that are called Sekunjalo. Sekunjalo was implicated in a commission of inquiry. In that commission of inquiry, their name came up. There was no trial. The commission of inquiry wasn't a legal process, but they were then supposed to be investigated and taken to court if they perpetuated a crime. But even before that happened, Nedbank and all other South African banks, white monopoly-owned banks, banks owned by the same apartheid criminals, closed all of Sekunjalo's accounts without a court ruling, without a court order. Sekunjalo went to the Equality Court. They sued, and the Equality Court ordered Nedbank and other banks to open Sekunjalo accounts because they had been closed discriminately. There was discrimination. They were closed because they were black. Yet, we had the issue of Marcus Euster of Steinhoff. His accounts still haven't been closed today. Steinhoff accounts have not been closed. Other directors of Steinhoff's accounts have not been closed. We had the issue of Tonga Hewlett that was also guilty of improprieties. Their bank accounts were not closed, but the black company, the Indian company's accounts was closed. Guptas, never taken to court. They were just found guilty in the court of public opinion because of negative articles. They were never brought into any court, but they went to a commission. The commission is not a legal process. People don't defend themselves in commissions. People do not question or interrogate evidence against them. So it is not a legal process. It's not due process. But their accounts were closed by the South African banking system, even though they had never been tried. So innocent black and brown people in South Africa have their bank accounts closed. South African banks will close Zimbabwean bank accounts that belong to Zimbabweans that have been put on a sanctions list illegally, without trial by the United States, without defending themselves from any allegations made by the United States. And then South African banks will close the banks of these people. They will close their accounts. They will freeze their funds. They will make sure that they refuse to transfer any of their funds. And they will deny them foreign currency or any banking services. But they won't do that to Glencore that has been found guilty. This is the reason why Zimbabwe anti-sanctions movement is currently in Gauteng High Courts, fighting South African banks for discrimination, for racism, for favoritism, and for illegally punishing innocent people without trial, and for implementing illegal sanctions that have been denounced by the UN and been found to be against international law. They implement such illegalities, but fail to block the accounts of clear criminals like Glencore that have perpetuated colonialism, that continue neo-colonialism, that fund terrorism, that also bribe and corrupt, and that potentially fund terrorists and undertake organized crime on the African continent. It's not the first time Glencore is found in this situation. Mike Rich, the owner of Glencore, was also indicted in the United States courts for bribery and corruption. But today, we see them still having open accounts, still functioning. But the Guptas had their accounts closed without any court judgment against them. Sekunjala had its accounts closed without any court case against them. And Zimbabweans continue to suffer, having their bank accounts closed by South African banks illegally in the implementation of illegal sanctions that have been deemed illegal by the UN and crimes against humanity. We need to continue to fight this. But the problem that we have on the African continent is our bankers, our reserve bankers, our bankers in our merchant banks and our commercial banks, and our government officials in the finance department continue to sign agreements that force our nations to comply with laws made by the G7 nations, the most criminal nations, the most human rights violators, nations of crimes against humanity, nations that have caused the greatest wars and don't want Africa to compete. We go and sign agreements that those nations have made that are tailored to stop Africa from developing. We sign anti-money laundering laws, we sign counter-terrorism laws, we sign laws pertaining to organized crime that allow people to be punished without trial, without going through due process. And we wonder why Africa is behind. It's clearly stupid for the financial minister of Zimbabwe to be a signatory to creating laws in Zimbabwe that are under the duress or caused by the duress of the G7's FATF or Financial Action Task Force rules that have no bearing on international law. Today, the Financial Action Task Force has got 39 nations. The only African country in the Financial Action Task Force is South Africa because it is still apartheid-controlled banking system and financial system and its privately owned reserve bank, which continue to determine rules according to the colonial rules that benefit the colonizer and exploit Africa. Why would our finance ministers, our reserve bank governors on the African continent, in South Africa, sign up to the rules of the colonizer, sign up to the rules of nations that have illustrated an intent and continued need to exploit Africa for their own survival? It doesn't make sense. So that is why I'm making this video, to educate you on what is the Financial Action Task Force and its regulations that are not international law, that are being employed and forced upon other nations as international law that goes to punish people and close people's accounts and to remove banking systems from the international banking system without trial. Yet, when Western countries break international law, when they break the laws of the countries in which they operate, when they bribe and corrupt, when they go and fund terrorism, their bank accounts are never closed because their job is to pillage Africa, and they are allowed to money launder proceeds that they get from exploiting Africa. It's only the Africans that will not be allowed to bank, will not be allowed to compete. It's the Indian who will not be allowed to go into financial areas that whites want a monopoly, who will be punished by anti-money laundering laws that are applied discriminately, that are a discrimination and a segregation, just like apartheid, colonialism, and slavery. It's time for us to end this nonsense. And it's time for our financial practitioners to stop, to become decolonized, and to stop continuing colonialism through the application of arbitrary and unilateral laws of the West to continue to subjugate Africa.